Manifesto of the Free Humans, Part 3 of the Conscious Resistance Trilogy, by John Vibes and Derrick Broze. Note from Derrick and John. Thank you for taking the time to conclude the journey that we began in 2015 with the release of Reflections on Anarchy and Spirituality. By examining the intersection of spiritual practices predating organized religion and the political philosophy known as anarchism, we believe we successfully carved out a new path for those who reject authority in their spiritual and political beliefs. Reflections laid the foundation for what we believe can help create a more balanced and free world. It could be considered the body of our philosophy. The second book, Finding Freedom in an Age of Confusion, could also be considered the heart of our ideas. In a series of essays, we explored the human struggle for freedom. We talked about how to overcome the depression, confusion, and fear that often comes along with understanding the harsh realities of our world. For this final installment in our series, we will explore various corners of anarchist philosophy and provide workable solutions for creating a free society. This book could be considered the mind of our philosophy. Our goal is to provide our brothers and sisters with a how-to guide for individual healing and empowerment, community building, and ultimately for breaking away from the state to form new communities. In Reflections, we briefly explored the history of the anarchist philosophy and the American libertarian movement. By providing the history of the thinkers and ideas we are drawing from, we hope to illustrate the evolution of the concepts that have come to be known as the conscious resistance. Our focus has been the libertarian and anarchist movements because they have historically contained the most radical activism and propaganda. Although the term libertarian may have varied meanings around the world, it is a term that is rooted in anti-authoritarian, anti-statist philosophy. In America, this libertarian philosophy can be traced back to Josiah Warren, America's first individualist anarchist. Warren was born in the late 18th century and helped expound the doctrine of individualist anarchism. He was responsible for launching several intentional communities, Utopia, Ohio, Modern Times, New York, that operated under his sovereignty of the individual ethic, which we will explore in the third part of this book. Warren would go on to work with and inspire Lysander Spooner, Benjamin Tucker, Voltaire de Cleyre, and other American anarchists, many of whom became known as the Boston Anarchists. For more information, we recommend reading Men Against the State. The work of these men and women would influence Austrian economist Murray Rothbard and other young freedom-minded Americans during the 1960s. Rothbard would borrow ideas and inspiration from the Boston anarchists and add Austrian economics and subjective value theory to craft his philosophy of anarcho-capitalism. We perceive our work as a continuation and expansion of the individualist anarchist tradition that predates the many modern anarchist divisions such as anarcho-communism and anarcho-capitalism. We also hope to expand upon and continue Samuel Konkin's agorist philosophy. Readers should note the use of the term libertarian refers to the philosophy that includes self-ownership, anti-authoritarianism, and individual sovereignty, not the American Libertarian Party, which we see as contradictory to libertarian and anarchist values. We do not intend to propose a one-size-fits-all model of anarchism, but instead seek to establish a world where people are free to move in and out of competing economic and political systems. This is commonly referred to as panarchy or panarchism, a concept that we will explore in depth later in the book. This would also allow individuals the freedom to vacate the state in favor of self-governance, or, if they choose, stay under the rule of the unsustainable state. However, we believe the inevitable and ongoing consciousness shift will erase the notion that statism and authoritarianism has any place in our world. We believe this shift in values and perceptions will lead to a lack of demand for continuing to live under the rule of government. Finally, please do not forget that each of you are powerful, beautiful, and free. The future depends entirely on the actions we choose to take today. We hope the following essays provide inspiration for those seeking to join the fight for a more free world. Part 1. A Strategy for Defeating the State. Overcoming the Fear of Freedom. Anarchy. It might be the most feared and propagandized term in existence. The public has an extremely distorted perception of the word, and most seem to be terrified of removing authority from their lives and allowing for self-organization. In fact, it is actually extremely rare for serious discussions on this topic to happen due to the knee-jerk reactions that are provoked when individuals are presented with the possibility of a world without authority. However, once one is able to find the courage to step beyond social convention and question the control systems they were born into, they will find that real anarchy is actually nothing like the doomsday fiction presented by mainstream culture. When looking deep enough into this situation, it becomes clear that the serious problems facing our species, such as war, poverty, and environmental destruction, are all exacerbated, if not created, by the legalized monopoly on force made possible by government. Ironically, these problems are always cited as reasons to keep the state intact, when in reality it is the state that is creating the problems in the first place. For centuries, those who reap benefits from the concept of authority have worked tirelessly to keep this idea alive. The parasite class has fought against the rising tide of human ingenuity, which has been progressively tearing away from the destructive traditions and control mechanisms of the past. Unfortunately, every time humanity has managed to overcome one oppressive tradition, the ruling class has been able to modify their propaganda to form a more convincing case for their authority. In the case of racial slavery in the American South, many slaves who were bred into life of servitude actually held the belief that slavery was not only a necessary price to pay for civilization, but was also in their best interest. When reading the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, one cannot help but notice the similarities between the brainwashing of colonial American slaves and the entranced modern American public. In this autobiography, Douglass points out that slaves would often argue about who had the better and wealthier master. He also described how many slaves came to equate slavery with wealth, and many slaves, Douglass included, believed that in the absence of slavery there would be no wealth, much in the same way that citizens today believe that there would be no peace or prosperity without government. The book details how Douglass had to first remove the chains of mental slavery before he could escape his physical bondage. One of the most profound passages describes the moment when he finally saw the North firsthand and learned that wealth could be achieved without slavery. Douglass wrote that, "I had very strangely supposed, while in slavery, that few of the comforts and scarcely any of the luxuries of life were enjoyed at the North, compared with what were enjoyed by the slaveholders of the South. I probably came to this conclusion from the fact that Northern people own no slaves. I suppose that they were about upon a level with the non-slave-holding population of the South. I knew they were exceedingly poor, and I had been accustomed to regard their poverty as the necessary consequence of their being non-slaveholders. I had somehow imbibed the opinion that, in the absence of slaves, there could be no wealth, and very little refinement. And upon coming to the North, I expected to meet with a rough, hard-handed, and uncultivated population, living in the most Spartan-like simplicity, knowing nothing of the ease, luxury, pomp, and grandeur of Southern slaveholders. Such being my conjectures, anyone acquainted with the appearance of New Bedford may very readily infer how palpably I must have seen my mistake. In humanity's dark history, there were periods where gangs of men could own the lives of millions by claiming to be given that right by a supernatural being. Once that excuse fell out of favor, the power-hungry authoritarians were forced to create new justifications for their authority. This desire for elite groups of individuals to rule over large areas of land and conquer the inhabitants within is what gave rise to our current political paradigm. The popular myth states that the people created things like governments and militaries as a compromise to create a mostly peaceful world. In reality, these organizations were all created by sophists and aristocrats specifically intending to enslave entire populations. As the general public has become more intelligent, increasingly complex rationalizations for authoritarian powers have become necessary to keep the herds in line. Ideas like the social contract, the national interest, common good, majority rule, and representative government have replaced the divine right of kings and the privilege of the aristocracy. In today's more sophisticated culture, it is necessary to make people believe they rule themselves in order to effectively rule over them. This is why the rhetoric of the social control systems that we live under is riddled with euphemisms that hide the oppressive and violent nature of their existence. The mass murder of innocent people is called defense, strong-arm robbery is called taxation, kidnap and extortion is called justice, and gangs of people who claim dominion over specific geographic locations are called governments. Government is itself another one of the words that means different things to different people. But when examined objectively, it becomes apparent that organizations known as government always maintain a monopoly on the use of force over a given territory. Consider that this is the primary characteristic shared by all governments throughout history. To describe the entity as anything other than a monopoly on violence is euphemistic and dishonest. We are surrounded by a false definition of the word government, just as we are surrounded by a false definition of the word anarchy. We have been told that the word government is simply the inevitable form civilized society takes, but this may be one of the most deceptive linguistic tricks used since the Dark Ages, as it implies that structure and organization will cease to exist in the absence of institutionalized violence and central planners. Since all governments share the common characteristics of establishing and promoting institutionalized violence, we can safely say that a lack of government would increase the opportunity for peace. In other words, when there is peaceful, spontaneous order in a society, there is anarchy. But when a society is organized around the constant threat of institutionalized violence, there is government. This is not to say that violence would never occur in a society without government, but it would be justified and celebrated, but it would not be justified and celebrated, nor would it be as widespread or powerful. Despite the obvious violence inherent in the institution of government, many people have a difficult time considering the possibility of a world without such a monopoly. When someone suggests that we simply do away with this unjust and unnecessary organization, they are typically met with negative reactions. This conversation often ends very quickly because both sides have completely different ideas of what the word government actually means. If we want to examine government from an outsider's perspective, we would see a world where people are grouped into two different categories, those in government and those not. At face value, we can see that these two groups of people have completely different standards and expectations, even though they are the same species and have the same basic needs. Looking closer, we can see that these different standards and laws are not neutral, and in fact, they are very much benefiting those in government at the expense of those who are not. The most important discrepancy to mention here is the fact that many government employees and agents of the state have the legal authority to steal, cage, or kill you. However, if you ask any random person on the street to define government for you, they will likely repeat the propaganda taught in government school. You know, the tale about how government is the backbone of civilization and the means by which people in the community come together for mutually beneficial projects. This may sound good, but it isn't at all true, because the government does not produce anything and would not be able to provide any services if it wasn't for the resources forcibly extracted from the rest of society. Therefore, it is safe to say that all functions that are currently being carried out by the organization known as government could actually be better served by the individuals in the community working together for common goals without the middlemen, since all the resources and labor is coming from them to begin with. Voluntary trade, charity, and other peaceful methods of interacting would create a far better society than the one that we see today. The most common argument against having a stateless society is the notion that we are all stupid, worthless savages who would not be able to figure out how to build something as simple as a road if there wasn't someone with a gun in our face every step of the way, telling us how, when, and where to do it. But if people are stupid savages, and politicians are people, then isn't the government made up of a bunch of stupid savages who should not be trusted with the license to kill? If we are all equal and supposedly incapable of governing ourselves, why should we trust other incompetent people to rule over us? Of course, we know this to be a propaganda spread by the powers that wish they were. There is nothing that a government can do that you and a large group of focused individuals cannot accomplish. The government does not provide services, they simply take money from everyone and use a small portion to sell back services to the people. Looked at in these terms, it becomes apparent that the government is nothing more than a violent middleman who forces their way into nearly every interaction that takes place between each of its so-called citizens. Everything that the government does is an attack on people who don't belong to that organization. If you think about it, every single action the government takes is some kind of punitive measure against people who are not a part of the club. Even when the government claims to do something for the goodwill of all people, they are doing so with resources collected by using threats and violence. There is no such thing as a virtuous act of government. This organization is not here to protect your rights. In fact, when the government steps in and gives itself the responsibility to protect your rights, it is simultaneously stripping you of your ability to defend yourself. When you are dependent upon the whims and capabilities of another human being to protect your rights, you are literally handing your rights over to them and opening yourself to slavery. Although there are only a few examples of stateless societies and communities throughout history that we know of, this should not be seen as a failure of anarchist philosophy. The lack of examples says more about the primitive condition of the human race thus far than it does about the possibility of a stateless society. Humanity is constantly accomplishing feats and smashing paradigms previously believed to be impossible. So to say that a society without institutionalized violence is impossible because there are not many historical examples is to say that our current state of affairs is the pinnacle of human achievement. This is obviously a naive, arrogant, and blatantly false worldview which has been projected onto the entire planet through the institutions and conventions established by those who claim ownership over other free human beings. These institutions and conventions are the very reason why many people have such a distorted view of words like government and anarchy. Our cultural norms have been handed down from those in power, so it is only natural that these norms reflect the needs and interests of the power structure rather than the needs of the people. Therefore, the perceptions of government and anarchy that many of us have adopted are not accurate descriptions of reality. but simply a description of the world as seen through the eyes of our rulers. In a system of government, our rulers have infinite power and control. In the absence of government, they are forced to live by the same rules and standards as everyone else. The ill-informed will make the mistake of believing that anarchy means without rules, but what it truly means is without centralized authority ruling over others. In the eyes of the tyrant, a world without complete dominion over the lives of others is a life of lawlessness, chaos, and disorder. This view does not reflect reality, but instead reflects the deranged worldview that drives the parasitic state and corporate classes. This is why a peaceful term like anarchy has such a negative social stigma, while a word like government is seen as a benign and unquestionable construct of nature. We have adopted the language and worldview of our oppressors. It's time for the free hearts and minds of the world to overcome the fear of freedom, reject the authoritarians and statists, and begin governing ourselves.